next slide I wanted to talk about is rent standards. That's come up a few times. You know, we've kind of dropped hints about rent standards. So, rent standards, what some people do is say, they'll just say FMR, okay? But we're gonna dispel all that because rent standards in the HOPWA program are way broader than just the fair market rent. Rent standards are amounts that set the maximum rent allowable for a unit. So for a unit to be allowable when you're using TBRA, you know, it has to pass inspection, right? Right. The gross rent for the unit needs to meet your program rent standard. So your gross rent is the landlord requested rent plus a utility allowance if utilities are not included. If utilities are included, then the landlord requested rent is also the gross rent, okay? So you're going to be looking at when you want to check to see if you can assist a unit with TBRA, assuming it passes inspection, the gross rent for the unit needs to meet your rent standard, and then it needs to meet rent reasonableness too, but that's on the next slide. Rent standard amounts assume that big maximum cap, that cap includes rent plus utilities. But as you know, sometimes utilities aren't included. Per HOPWA regulations, it is the grantee's responsibility to establish rent standards for its entire service area. Right? So they can establish rent standards for the entire state, just like we did when we were administering TBRA. There are a few things that you should know about rent standards. You should make sure your policies and procedures include what your rent standards amounts are and information about when those amounts are updated. And you should make sure you have documentation in your file about the amount of the gross rent for the unit and showing that the gross rent meets your established rent standard. Now, I don't know if you were aware, but HUD's Office of HIV Housing came out with a notice in June of 2022 clarifying how rent standards must be established and clarifying options for establishing rent standards. Then Steve and I did a big presentation to talk about the notice itself. So I'm not sure, Henry, what are you using right now for rent standards?
Probably an outdated manual that needs.
Probably FMR, okay.
I was gonna say, we use whatever the housing.
Okay.
Housing authority.
Okay, so the notice clarifies some options and some things that a grantee needs to do. So say for instance, you had been using fair market rent, okay? You could continue to use fair market rent, or the grantee could, but now the notice is saying, because they clarified it, the grantee needs to make sure that how it has established its rent standards in the past are in compliance with new guidance. And the new guidance is you can establish rent standards two ways without getting approval from a field office. But to be clear, the grantee needs to get approval from the field office. So you can use the FMR, all the FMR amounts for your entire service area, or you can use the local PHA payment standard amount for each PHA in the service area, as long as those payment standards are not set at small area FMRs, fair market rents. If they are set at small area fair market rents, then the grantee would need to get permission to use those amounts. Then the notice goes into some other options that are available that you could do a mix and match. You could do an FMR for one area or the PHA payment standard from one area. You can use one set of PHA payment standards for the whole service area. Or the grantee can even establish its own payment standard amounts at a percentage above fair market rent. We have been working with some grantees that are gonna be, going through the process of getting field office approval to establish their rent standards at 130% of the FMR. Maine recently got approved. Their rent standard is 150% of the FMR. Some places are doing 135, some places doing 115.
But that helps with your
Yes.
utilities, 'cause then you get more utilities.
Yes. So this is something
And particularly for
We can
bigger
talk-
areas that are mixed.
we can
between-
talk with Henry more about.
Between urban and rural, that's where Heather's saying mix and match.
Mix and
Even if
match.
they're using FMRs for certain counties, because they're rural, the FMR is fine, then they're using a percentage for urban areas, particularly if they're in college towns where rents are ridiculous.
Right.
They're going through that permission of saying, these counties are this county's totally separate.
Right.
Right, so that mix and match for what works for your program.
But using a mix and match, you need to get the grantee needs to get field office approval for that. So there's some cool things that HOPWA is doing, regarding their rent standards. There had been conflicting guidance out there for a while about rent standards and what that means and how you can establish them. So they came out with this notice, so I would look through that. But just to be clear though, again, the grantee has to do that. And that's something we can, talk with, Henry about later. Because we have been working with some other grantees to compile a bunch of information and submit that to the field office to get approval to use different amounts.
That's correct. Good job.
So that goes up.
Sure. So I touched on rent reasonableness. Remember, gross rent for the unit needs to meet your rent standard and rent reasonable. So rent reasonable just means that the rent charged for the unit must be reasonable in relation to rents currently being charged for comparable unassisted units in the private market. And cannot be in excess of rents currently being charged by the owner for comparable unassisted units. A good practice is when you're doing rent comparability, you at least have three comps, three comparables. There, I put a link to a HOPWA rent reasonableness checklist and certification that is good to use.
And so we only use that for TBRA, right?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. You don't need to do rent reasonableness for STRMU,
Okay. I was
for,
just
yeah, yep,
clearing
you're
that.
correct.
You hear that, Condon?
So when you're doing rent reasonableness, make sure your client files include documentation that first of all, you're showing the gross rent for the unit meets rent reasonableness. So this would include your checklist and backup information about the comps that you're using, the units. Make sure that you're not using the same units as comps over and over and over again. We've heard this from HUD. This is something HUD would notice
So
and they would find.
don't you just find places in that area around the same type of?
Yes, you could. Yep. But also too, if you're having difficulty finding a comparable unit within a 3-mile, 2-mile radius, you can expand your radius. There's absolutely nothing saying that you cannot do that. You can expand your radius. You could even use, even if you couldn't say say you have these like unicorn units, like a 4-bedroom or a 5-bedroom unit. It can be hard sometimes to find comps for that. So you could just use a unit that might be a 3-bedroom, but has all the other attributes. Or you could also too, if you couldn't find a comp and you're doing your due diligence and looking, note that in the file that because of the size of the unit or the type of unit, you couldn't find
Like a
comps. There
handicap
aren't any.
unit or something,
Right, there aren't any. So it's about doing your due diligence.
I have a question about that. I don't know if you're gonna get to it, but so on like the rent reasonable, when it says accessibility, what does that mean? Am I putting like close to a bus route, or am I putting it's you go in and then you have to go up steps? Cause I don't,
I have to look at the form. It says accessibility. It could be that. Handicapped accessibility,
like,
bus routes, amenities.
that's
Right.
well, amenities is under that. So
Okay.
that's like, I don't know.
I would say accessibility, like giving usability, wheelchair ramp.
See,
Does
that's what I'm.
Is there,
Like elevator, no elevator, like that type. of thing,
is
right?
there a section on the form? I should click the link that talks about, like accessible to transportation, like bus routes, shopping. Okay.
Because I would put, on that, I would put 2 blocks from bus route, or, I mean, I'm right on there when I think.
Yeah, it probably then related to handicapped accessible unit.
So I could put like bottom floor, 3 steps up
Yeah.
or something.
Or if it's not a tagged as that type of unit, just write no.
Because it's like, say there's a comp that's a little bit cheaper, but my lady can't walk up 12 stairs. Then
Right.
Like, that's something I could note on there.
We did actually a presentation about rent reasonableness during the waiver.
Yeah.
The waiver stuff, so it's buried in information about the waiver. So if you don't listen to the waiver things, because that's gone, but just focus on the rent reasonableness, there are a lot of options and creative ways to do rent reasonableness. And HUD reviewed all those presentations. So what is in that presentation is accurate and okay to do.
I should do a thing like
Was that?
the calculated thing for that.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Scenario.
Yeah.
Because that would.
The reason I say don't use the same comps every time is because field offices have told us they've seen this. They literally gone in and seen photocopy in the same unit. You're not really doing rent reasonableness. Yeah. Anything else? You can also too, if you have available in this area, there are some free web-based systems that can do rent reasonableness for you.
Well, it's on that thing that they pulled up, it said rent reasonable. But it-
Yes,
We used to use-
socialserve.com.
We used to use socialserve.com.
Free.
And it's free for nonprofits. What you do is you go in, they teach you how to use it. You go in, you enter information about the unit. And then all the characteristics, you got to ask a bunch of information about the unit and it will auto load. Like you have like a radio button. How many comparables do you want? And it will auto load all the comparables for you.
Like for the area.
Yeah.
Oh, that's the best thing.
And
Yeah.
that
So
was
they
one of the
got
things where we
print
said
out
we had a form we have the landlord fill out. That included all of the questions we needed for social serve.
Yeah.
To answer these questions. So we plug that in, we say within a 5-mile radius, it would bring up 12 comparables. We pick 2, then it would print out, we sign and date it and throw it in the file.
So I have to go out and use that.
And it even sometimes, it even has a little picture of the unit, of the building, the comp.
But it was also great backup documentation if there weren't comparables. 'Cause
Right.
it'd say no comparables, and that's what we would print out and sign and date it.
Well, we'd look, like, there was one, where was that? Way up north.
Yeah.
In Maine, I did like a 3-mile radius. I didn't get anything back. Then I did, okay. Then I'm like, okay, 15. I didn't get anything back. Then I did a 20-mile. Then I'm like, I got 2 comparables back.
That's how I do.
Right.
Oh,
Next one. We talked about this earlier, housing search process. Programs should make sure to have in their policies and procedures and provide assisted households with information about how long they have to find a unit, right? You've just awarded TBRA. How many days do they have to find a unit? This is not in HOPWA regulations. It's guidance we provide all the time on the HOPWA Ask a Question desk. Generally, search times should be related to your local market conditions. Why would you give somebody 30 days when you know they need at least 60, right? So you could start with 60 days, and then you could do 2 30-day extensions. You could even follow housing choice voucher regulations and look at their housing search periods and adapt it for HOPWA programs. Even under the HCP program, you can have up to 180 days as requested as a reasonable accommodation. Just make sure you have that described in your policies and procedures, and you're talking to your assisted households about how long. And they should, be keeping in touch with you, right? If you're giving them 60 days, I would definitely explain to them to keep in touch with you on the regular basis, or you should check in with them. Do you need any leads? Have you found any units yet? Do you think you're going to need more time? Also, tracking rental assistance. I bring this up because I've seen this a couple of times, and I've heard it from my field offices about going to either a grantee or the project sponsor and not seeing something like financial tracking about people with whom they're providing rental assistance to. I think of this as like a rent roll, something your accounting department would have, right, where you set up and you have like a running rent roll every month, and you have your list of households, or even just the ID, right, the client ID, and then on that you also have the move-in date, right, the date they moved into the unit. You have the gross rent for the unit on there. You have housing assistance payment, right? That's what the program is paying, and you have their portion. And you can have other things on there too. The move-in date will give you a time where you're going to be approximately doing the annual research. So there you have a method where you're tracking your housing assistance payments, and you're tracking when you're going to be doing annual recertifications, all on one form. It's just like an accounting rent roll that we created literally in QuickBooks.
I would say, but like when we enter our payments in HMIS.
Yeah, it's not something that has to be in the client file. It's really a billing and invoicing method to
It just makes
use.
it easy for monitoring, because
Yes.
our rent roll too, we'd have a note that if it was the last month of assistance, because someone was moving on, we would say last month. The next month, we would keep them on, zero it out, put them in red, and say client ended last month.
Right.
So it's easy for anyone coming to monitor, say, oh, you paid November, but not December, because they moved on. They look in the file and see all of that there too.
Yeah.
So it was all sort of outlined in one quick spreadsheet. So when HUD came in and said, show us your rents for November, one spreadsheet, and that's what they started with.
Or if you're going to leave as a project sponsor and you want to provide something to the new project sponsor in order to know you're paying rent, that would be a great courtesy.
A rent roll is the perfect thing to be creating.
TBRA, its own program in HMIS, so I'm going to enter them and exit them, so you just pull it off the list.
Oh, I was screwed.
Yeah.
I mean, that's,
Yeah.
no, I just did this.
Yeah. Your
I just did
HMIS
this
thing would be
because I was
something
worried
different.
About that alone.
Mhm.
Like, how would they know who my TBRA people are if I don't make them into the other program? Now, I haven't got them all in there yet, but I'm working.
Right, but like a rent roll or a tracking is internal to your organization. It's not a big HMIS thing. It's specific to your TBRA clients, even if they had like a rent change, right? And they had an annual, it's really a great tool. So we would just go in every month and say, did we do any changes this month? Did we have any annuals? And then we would go in and change it right in the rent roll. And then we used Careware. We were an aid service organization, so we enter a new service in Careware
So that's
to do that. And then the rent roll was a financial tool to use for billing, and We didn't have any project sponsors. We were the grantee and we just did everything ourselves in-house. But when HUD came, we present, here's our rent roll for this grant. Which month do you want? What can you give me? All of them. And it would be February, March, April, May, and it would just all roll in together.
I know this is an impossible question,
I'm like,
but I'm gonna ask it anyway. Do you have either probably personally, it would have to be at this point, but, an ideal file?
Yes. We do monitoring presentations a lot. That's another favorite thing. I used to do low-income housing tax credit monitoring. So HOPWA monitoring is a piece of cake compared to tax credit.
I work
You know
at the
tax credits
I
are?
work at the tax department.
Tax credit units? Woo, tax credit, yeah,
I think that's what I'm thinking.
that's IRS.
That's
Yeah,
the
no,
process
tax
of
department.
dot every I,
Yeah,
left every wrong. You didn't lift
Yeah, I gotta
every
look
rock,
at this
it's not
book
on.
and this book and that book, you know. Yeah,
Sounds like the devil.
yep,
So do you send
we do, yes, we do.
Or do we, can you give them?
Or does
I can
Henry
give it
have-
to Henry.
Or does Henry have to pay?
Yeah, an ideal file, yep. And I'm very picky about I'm very picky about what files, how they're set up.
I wish I would have brought ours.
Yeah.
I feel like most people-
We've created example files before, and I always say, you have a TBRA program, and say you have 6 section files, whatever your sections are. Every single file layout should be exactly the same. Yes,
Yeah.
you're gonna have different case notes, different situations and different
Like maybe
scenarios,
documents.
but the HIV documentation is gonna be in the same flap in every single file.
That
The
makes-
HQS is gonna be in the same flap in every single file.
I get so
And it's gonna be
excited about-
chronological. It's gonna be chronological, so you can just flip from the earliest from the latest to the earliest. Latest on the bottom, earliest on the top.
And what
And no sticky notes ever. Sticky notes.
Sticky notes.
Or
are-
staples.
I'll staples them up.
So one reason we always talk about too, about keeping applications together, is so in our ideal client file that we created, monitors should need to read through your case management case notes to know what happened. You're gonna have things in that case notes that are not relevant to HOPWA or TBRA.
Right,
So they shouldn't have to read through about your client's mental health issues and schizophrenia and all of that, just to say, and then they said $800 in income. So the idea of setting this up was they would look at HIV in flap 1, they'd see releases in flap 2, they'd see annuals in flap 3. Who cares about the rest? That wasn't the scope of it, and so
Yeah.
it didn't matter about what else got.
Yeah. they might just flip through the case notes, but
They're
the-
saying that they're all monthly.
the case note, the case note isn't like a
Kind of don't-
HUD regulatory thing.
Kind of thing.
It's the income, the verification, the inspections, the correspondences. I'm gonna get to. Yeah.
So
Yeah,
we could
but we
definitely
do.
share that. Here we go, part of it.
So these are some common items to include in a TBRA file. It's not exhaustive. So certification forms for, client eligibility. Right? Documenting HIV/AIDS status. Income certification and recertification forms. So every single income and recertification you do should be in the client file. Intake information would be like forms and applications, client information, history, like, some of this would all be on one like application packet. Referral forms, if applicable. If somebody self-referred themselves, you wouldn't have a referral form, right? Individual housing services plan or housing care plan, release of information. This says participation agreement. Remember how I said I like tenant responsibility agreement better? It just sounds more adult to say tenant responsibility than program participation agreement. Case notes, correspondences with the client. So correspondences would be like, thank you for coming in for your annual recertification based on your income, your portion of rent effective blah is this amount, right? So you're doing things in writing back and forth. You could also include a similar letter to the landlord, right? Be aware that effective February 1st, ABC's income, portion of rent is now this. We are going to now pay this, so they know.
Should you keep, like, if the intake form is changed because of the number of households, should you keep in the back of the file, the old paperwork?
Usually I would just do it chronologically, so the earlier stuff would go on the bottom and more recent stuff would go on the top.
Yeah.
But if you guys have another way that they want you to do it, then, yeah.
The one thing we should note too, about one reason we say common items to include in a TBRA file is in our agency, we had a separate TBRA file from everything else because the TBRA had way more paperwork. So instead of having a file that was huge, even if the client would have HOPWA support services case management, the TBRA file would be totally separate file. So we might get income for client and photocopy it in two different files because we want HOPWA eligibility for case management and HOPWA eligibility for TBRA. But so that way we didn't end up with these crazy huge files. We just went ahead and split it. Because internally in the agency, if HUD came into monitor and say, oh, we're going to look at case or support services and TBRA, we might pull two files for the same client, but it's all there. But it existed independently. It was easier for us to manage instead of trying to cram everything for one person into one tiny file.
So we separated like on sides of the thing, TBRA, then our regular.
So ours
And
is
then
separate
we have a
filing
whole
cabinets and
different,
everything.
like payment documentation file that goes with, like these two go together. everywhere we
Yeah.
go.
Now, we literally had TBRA files, supportive service, case management files. And case management could be HOPWA funded case management or Ryan White case management. Right, because we had Ryan White, we were Ryan White funded too. So but we didn't put any of our TBRA information at all in the case management files.
Because we wanted to make
They
sure,
would just get,
plus if Brian White or Medicaid came to monitor the case management file, they don't want to see HQS inspection forms and all that. I mean, they don't necessarily.
could, but yeah.
So it's just a way to easily clean this up for monitoring for any program. Say the most important things for TBRA, separate file.
It's just how I learned, so I just carried it from other organizations doing other rental assistance programs. We just always separated case management stuff from housing stuff. So I just carried that forward. Verification of household size, right? Household composition, income and assets, adjusted income. So that would be income allowances and deductions, income limits, right? We use the Excel tool, the Excel spreadsheet, through HOPWA. So we would just have income limits and staple it right to the tool. We would make sure that, when we were doing like a lease up or an annual, we had a copy of our current rent standards at the time. So that would go with the rent determination packet. Rent reasonableness and backup of the comps, rent calculation form, inspections, lead-based paid visual checklist, landlord contract, that's the contract between the program and the landlord. Leases, information about utilities, included, not included, and like a rental assistance approval letter. Just suddenly somebody just appears and they have rental assistance. It's a good idea to say you have been approved for rental assistance. And what size unit they've been approved for. And that in that letter too would also say you have an initial search period of 60 days. If you need extensions, please call and whoever you were going to be working with. I need another. Oh, there. Items that are commonly missing. Adequate or up-to-date releases of information. HIV status, income, backup and documentation, annual income updates, you're required to recertify income at least annually, inspection forms, and rent calculation worksheets. This isn't exhaustive, but these are some of the big ones. Big things that,
That are wildly common. Hudson
Yeah,
Center,
wildly
New
common,
Hampshire,
and are directly related to eligibility. Right.
How do
Yes.
you not have them two things and
I
that's
know.
all you need?
Right, yeah.
And I would say HOPWA's probably due for monitoring, so,
I mean, on your
When was the
end,
last time?
2016, so.
Yeah, I'd say you're due.
They're coming.
There, yeah. That's it for that. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you.
Do you guys want to take a quick break, potty break?
Sarah, we're gonna talk about the culture store ourselves, because we already know about it.
I think that's.
Yeah.
I was gonna say.
In other words, we just have the support services and resource ID that we can get through fairly easily.
Hey guys, we're gonna take, actually, we're gonna go in, yeah, we're gonna go and power through the next session. It's a pretty short session, so be one moment and I'll get switched over.